around the house was one of these framed papal blessing on the occasion of their marriage, and it caused embarrassment to Mum and Dad because they just didn't think much of it. But some well-meaning friend had got this for them, and it described him as Colonel Seamus Maguire. And of course that fascinated us boys, the idea of Dad being Colonel. So when I tried to pry some information out of him, in his usual fashion, he said, all of the rest of them are in jail. And to a large extent, it was true. My father, Jim Maguire, I'll be referring to him as Da, I suppose, is how we always called him. He was the youngest of 6 or 7 children. There's a bit of doubt about the seventh. The eldest, I think, was a Michael, who might have died very young and wasn't much reference to him in the family. So there was 3 boys and 3 girls survived. The eldest was a boy, Brian, who eventually got a bit of a farm from the Land Commission over at Anna, County Meath. And it left 3 girls, and then Tom and Jim Maguire. And they were reared in a thatched cottage a mile in from the road in Glenidan. And in their 20s or that later, they rebuilt it as a 2-story stone house that's still standing there today. And it seems to be a very Republican household. We know very little about our grandfather, James Maguire, but they certainly, his wife, Margaret Maguire, Brady was her maiden name. Oh, she was fiercely Republican until the day she died in 1945 or something, but 98 years of age. But the boys were very Republican. And I believe they were, at some point, they were in the IRB. That was never, Dad never mentioned that, but my mother did say it. And of course, it was a very big secret, because they were excommunicated and all. So they were very Republican from an early age. And then when, things were beginning to hot up in the early days before the Rising, they were making efforts to get some sort of a little thing going. And they had a Sinn Féin band. Dad was very musical, and he would have played anything, flute and tin whistle, or anything like that. And they had a band. And I know at some point they actually were able to pass the tunes into German prisoners of war in a camp in Oldcastle, and the Germans would pass them back fully arranged for whatever sort of a band they were playing in. And so the band was a big thing, and it was used a lot during, electioneering and in parades and anything. So they did a bit of drilling and marching on the roads and that. Very low key and very little enthusiasm. There were bursts of enthusiasm when the Carson volunteers started in the north and seemed like a huge threat. And their numbers in their little company of volunteers shot up, and then it would die down when things got quiet. And it shot up again when conscription was proposed. So, of course, everyone was up in arms about proscription, mainly for their own protection. They just didn't want to be hauled off, more than any great nationalist feelings. But the little core group of 10, 15 or so seemed to have carried on. And there was no harassment that I could ever heard of. In fact, I would say that the word from the RIC in Mullingar out was, don't cause trouble. And it seemed to work. There was no local outrages that would have sparked any sort of a reaction among the people and get young fellas fired up or anything. So it was a kind of an uphill struggle all the time to keep any sort of enthusiasm for the cause. So they did the best they could, and at various times, so they had no weapons or anything. They couldn't really be seen with weapons, I suppose, anyway. That wouldn't be too desirable. But I know he did make pikes, and what good they were going to be, but they were good for drilling purposes, and they made 20 or 30 pikes. He pinched a tree, I think, that had been cut down over in Battersby's in Carrick, and he got it sawed up into 2 by 2 inch poles. I know the sawmill, I was told, found this very puzzling. He could not figure out what the hell Jim Maguire was doing with these long bits of timber. And of course, Dad wouldn't give him any clue. And they had a blacksmith friend who made pike heads of some sort. So they used these for drilling up and down the roads with this old ex-British Army drill sergeant whose great battle cry was, he got it garbled a bit. Instead of prepare for cavalry, he would call out prepare for Calvary, which would cause the whole troop to fall around the road laughing, and cause him great annoyance and upset. He couldn't see what was so funny about it. So it was a very low-key business, and the sergeant would come out occasionally on a Sunday and he'd say, oh, I'd go out to visit my little Republican, and he'd sit and watch the parading and all. So it was very innocent and very low-key. As far as I know, Dad was never actually arrested during all the War of Independence. Certainly in the Civil War, he spent a lot of time in various jails at Athlone, the Curragh, Kilmainham, and Mountjoy, but he was never actually arrested. I know he was caught with that. He had a drill book, for a British Army drill book in his pocket, and he was caught with that, all right. And that precipitated a bit of a crisis, because up to that he had been tolerated, but word came from Dublin when the word got back to headquarters, Dublin Castle, that he had forbidden literature in a drill book. They were out to get him and arrest him, and I think at that stage he went on the run and spent several years, I guess, on the run, sleeping in other houses and all. Oh, there was one account of he sleeping, himself and his brother Tom, sleeping under a haycock at night, because the RIC were expected to raid, and they did come and raid. He told me that he spent the night and there was nothing but the top of his head sticking out. He'd burrowed in under the haycock, and in the morning his hair was all frozen solid with frost. And he just thought that was hilarious. But that was, in hindsight, that sort of thing, you could laugh at them. But at the time, it would have been serious enough. Well, he didn't really talk about it seriously. He told us outlandish stories to entertain us going to bed, and that. I got bits of truth. My mother would have been very truthful, and what she would say was she'd make little comments, and you could believe every word of those. But certainly, Dad dismissed it all. He was a very self-deprecating. he thought anything he would do or could do would be very little, and his efforts, he felt, were very little and very pathetic. And the evidence bears that out. I mean, he didn't actually, he might have set up ambushes and things or planned ambushes, but they never seemed to come to anything. And he never actually seemed to get around to shooting anybody or even shooting at anybody. And but no, it was everything was kept very, very quiet. There was no houses burned, nobody burnt, retaliation, because again, they didn't mount attacks on the local RIC barracks, which would have maybe brought about reprisals and escalated things. So I think largely due to clever management in Mullingar and the RIC, the whole thing was kept very quiet and very low key, and they just never succeeded. So they did, 1918 for the elections and all. They were very active then, and as he said, they voted morning, noon, and night for everyone dead, living and dead, and gone and everything. And they got the results all right. And there was Larry McGinnell that was elected in that time. That was the only, and even that I didn't even hear of any of that mentioned. No, he didn't talk. I suppose most people didn't talk about it, but he certainly felt that, he hadn't made any substantial difference anywhere, and he didn't feel it worth, and he probably wouldn't have talked anyway. So no, we didn't. We got the crazy stories, building huge mines and rolling them down hills to barrack doors and all sorts of things, but there were no truth in them at all. But that didn't matter to us. We believed every word of it. So it's only in later years, looking back and reading back, that we began to see a little bit of a picture of what the truth was. And his poor old daughter, a nun in California, was quite shocked to discover that her very much revered father had actually been seriously contemplating attacking people. They did carry out that famous capturing of the two magistrates, which, and there was one other incident there now that caused a lot of family anguish that I remember, was the rescue, or the planned rescue of Sean McKeown, the blacksmith of Ballinally, was that what he was called? And the word was to come to Jim that he was to rescue him. And people said, Maguire let them down and didn't carry out the rescue and all that. But my mother was very upset about that and talked about that. He never did. But she would say, no, the word never came to him. He never heard the word until McKeown was safely in Dublin. And the fact that he was being blamed for having cold feet or had failed to organize it, or was somehow to blame for failing to rescue him, that hurt deeply. But I quite believe that just, communications are fairly sketchy. And sometimes the messenger wasn't reliable and might choose not to deliver the message. So he didn't get it, and he didn't attempt to rescue. His name would have gone into the history books with a bang if he had been involved in an exercise like that and had succeeded. Dad had a shotgun. His father bought him a single-barrel shotgun. I was amazed to look back on that. I wouldn't have been very keen on farming, whereas Tom Maguire was a good farmer, great farmer, and obviously had a taste for it. And Tom would have been very intellectual, and he would have been very political, and he would think out and plan ahead, and he'd see a future for the movement and for the country, whereas Dad was more Divil McCare and get on with it. And he used the shotgun to feed the family with ducks and rabbits and things like that. He was more productive, I think, with the shotgun than with farming. And he had a little .38 revolver which was found years later when we were in holidays in Glenidan. And when he was handed it, he laughed. He said, "Oh, I love them, God, little gun. I used to bring that when I'd be going poaching eels out of Loch Lane." And he said, "I'd have that with me in case the RIC surprised us." And they never did. And they would catch eels, dozens of these huge big eels, 6 feet long, some of them, and massive things. And they boxed them and shipped them to Billingsgate Market in London. And he got money enough to buy more shotgun cartridges. So in the middle of the War of Independence, here they were boxing up fish and sending them to Billingsgate unmolested. So the whole thing is kind of a bit confusing to modern ears, like to kind of get a head around that sort of thing. But the shotgun, he had a good few cartridges, and apparently he bought more in Liverpool and brought them home. So I don't know about the 38, but I think he had, certainly for the Rising, they did plan to go with some of them to the Rising in Dublin, but of course they hadn't gone for the start of it because they read the Sunday Independent and they didn't think there was going to be a Rising. And it was certainly on Wednesday or Thursday before they were able to make any sort of an effort. And the people that were supposed to pick him up never turned up, and he hid the guns and went to Athboy and met some of them getting ready to go to Dublin, Gillicree, Subrin, and people like that. And so they only got as far as Dunboyne, and they were met. By that time, the British had patrols out and had checkpoints on all the roads leading into the city. So the little gang that hit off from Athboy all finished up, locked up before nightfall. And so Dad was at home, free to carry on, a bit of poaching and farming, and organising as best he could. But then, as I say, when he was caught eventually with the manual, the drill manual, that was evidence enough. And Dublin Castle seemed to feel, right, this fellow is dangerous and we want him arrested. They were picking them off. Anybody that they figured, they must have had spies, and they were able to figure out who was significant, and they were arresting them and keeping them well out of the way. So when he found that he was really being wanted at that stage, he apparently went to Liverpool. I'm not too sure. He did tell me about working at the docks in Liverpool, but there was also something about working in a factory or something, I don't know. He told me about working in the docks, unloading ships with some sort of nuts from South America or somewhere, and it was for animal feed or something. And the gaffer gave him a lot of overtime and holiday work and Sunday work and all sorts of things, seemed to be very favourable to him. And he seems to have used all the money he could get his hands on to buy guns. And of course, his innocent plan was to get the guns home to Glenidan. And my mother described that the guns were sent back to Dublin in Jacobs biscuit crates. Biscuits were exported from Jacobs in big timber crates, which could be reused. And they were sent to Liverpool and distributed, and then the crates returned to Dublin. So one night, a crate was dropped off outside the digs, and the lads brought it in and filled it with guns and packed it and put it back out, and a truck came back and picked it up. But he told me that the guns never got past Dublin. The people in Dublin were so delighted to get their hands on a lot of guns. So all his hard work in Liverpool and saving and skimping and buying guns and risking everything went to supply guns to Dublin, but none to Glenidan. So I think, and then Ma had a story which we believe because she told the truth, that she brought guns home. There was guns turned up after the biscuit box went back, and she brought them back in a suitcase and was even stopped by customs going on board the ship. And the man said, "Oh, that's a very heavy case. What have you in it?" And she said, "Oh, a couple of bottles of whiskey. Are you coming on the ship?" And she was very pretty girl at the time and very attractive. So he laughed and he said, "No, I'm not going. I can't go." He said, he called one of the lads on deck. He said, "Here, help this girl with this case and keep a good eye on her. She has whiskey in the case." And she brought the whiskey, put the guns on board and brought them back. They may have got back to Westmeath all right, but I don't know. She never said what type of guns or how many were in it. He had been in and out of Mullingar a good bit with the electioneering and the 1918 election and that. And so he would have been known, but apparently somebody from headquarters made the decision to appoint him officer commanding. And it certainly caused some resentment. They didn't know him, and they didn't know, and he hadn't a great military record, apart from the arrest of the two magistrates, which was very dramatic and successful in its own way. And that he, so suddenly being put in charge of Mullingar ruffled quite a few feathers, and but he got on with it as best he could. But he didn't feel that he had any competence in organising. He seemed to have great regard for Joe Kennedy and Castlepollard as a man who could organise. And throughout his life, he remained in very good terms with Joe, and always conferred with him when people were applying for pensions, that he would go to Joe to discuss it. And he used Joe in later years as an intermediary with Joe as a junior minister of state at the time in social welfare, I think. And I remember being brought into his office in bus hours at a time when people like Mickey Traynor was on hunger strike in Mountjoy in 1941, 42 sort of thing. And there was great fears for his life because some of them did die on that hunger strike. And like Neil, I think, and some more. But Dar would have had good introduction into Fianna Fáil contacts through Joe Kennedy, and Joe would have been very good and helpful to get messages to De Valera and that at the time, who wouldn't yield political status to them. But certainly, I asked Dar, like we marveled at the idea that he would be in command in Mullingar, and there was around the house there was one of these framed papal blessing on the occasion of their marriage, and it caused embarrassment to Nanda because they just didn't think much of it. But some well-meaning friend had got this for them, and it described him as Colonel Seamus Maguire. And of course, that fascinated us boys, the idea of that being colonel. So when I tried to pry some information out of him, he, in his usual fashion, he said, all of the rest of them are in jail. And to a large extent, it was true. The British were identifying and picking them off one by one, the leaders or potential leaders, and getting them locked up safely out of the way. Didn't work altogether, mind you, but around the Midlands it did work fairly well. There's no doubt Tom Maguire and Jim, as I say, Tom was more the political, intellectual man who would have been looking at the long term and all that. But Tom went on as Sinn Féin member and was chairman of Westmeath County Council on a few occasions, and would cycle in the 14 miles in the pouring rain to council meetings. So he was very diligent public representative. But that wasn't all quite of that. He was different material, but they complemented very well, and Dad had huge regard for Tom's judgment. But at the end of the day, they say there wasn't any great battles fought. He talked about ambushes and that, but they never came off then. The crowd always went the wrong way or something and went there. No, we learned very little from him, and his statement to the Military History Bureau was a hell of a shock to us to get the details of these things, which was all, of course, and I suppose all children are a bit astonished when they hear the details of their parents' youth and youthful indiscretions and escapades, we call them, and that. Now, as far as I know, Mick Murray from Ballinaccarrigy, and I don't know how he and that, but there was, I heard some reference that he was the intelligence officer, but it doesn't appear that I've seen in much, and I'd have to go back and look at his record, but certainly he was very instrumental in recruiting the famous Susie Poole, who was married. I presume Susie was a Mullingar girl. She was married to a British Army officer who is now in India, and he, she was on her own in Mullingar, and she, being an officer's wife, was part of the social circle among officers' wives and would have had access to all the chit-chat and gossip about troop movements and promotions and secondments and everything else was happening, which would have been of huge interest to people. And I believe Mick Murray introduced her to Mick Collins, who got a lot of information through her about things that would have been of great interest to him. Mick Murray was a very regular visitor, almost weekly, to play cards in our house. It was a matter of source of huge entertainment and fun, because he was a very, very entertaining man. So the Murrays were very close, but Mick Murray didn't tell everything that was going on. I think there was a lot about Susie Poole that my father never heard in those days, because certainly when her name would be mentioned at home in Malahide Road, man, Dad would have great laughing. It was obviously a source of great entertainment to them. And even the name was sort of peculiarly attractive, Susie Poole. It was something wonderfully mysterious about her. Tom and himself would have been very anti-treaty. And what he told me was that while he was in Mullingar, I think they were in the military barracks, which had been vacated at that stage. The troops had all been moved back to England. And Todd Andrews was sent down from Dublin as a liaison officer. And the bit he did tell me was, and it was just simple, unvarnished, was that word came from headquarters. They were to give back the military barracks to the British to enable them to use it as a staging post, bringing all the troops back from the west of Ireland. They would hold them in Mullingar until they had a train ready, and they could go from Mullingar right out onto the pier at Dunleary, the mailboat pier, so that they didn't have to appear on the streets anywhere and be subjected to abuse or anything. And so that was the orders from Dublin, and Dad's reaction was, well, I told Todd that I wouldn't give the barracks back, let them sleep in the ditch like we did. And he said, so I moved out and I went to the RIC barracks. I think it was, he said, the RIC barracks. So whatever little few people he had still around him. And Todd Andrews apparently remained in command in the military barracks and handed it over, presumably for the demobilization or the withdrawal of troops. So he was anti-treaty from that on, and we really, again, we never got details. He never told us anything. Little comments that picked up. He referred one day, we know he was in Athlone jail. Now, it was the military barracks, I think, in Athlone there beside the river. And he led an escape there one night. About 10 or 11 of them, I think, got over the wall, made ropes or something, and got over, and he and a few more stole a rowing boat and paddled their way with their hands across the river under the railway bridge, even though there was a sentry on the bridge, and they got over quietly enough, and he escaped off into home territory and hid out in a house of a couple of fairly reasonably advanced age, a Protestant couple that knew him and he knew it was a really good, safe house. They bought a little shop in Thomas Street, which was empty, derelict sort of thing, and they borrowed £400 and they bought the shop. And they borrowed more money then and bought stock, and they ran a shop there. And the family had Enda, Ina, Noel, and me. I was born in the shop, and they moved out of that, then sold the shop a year after I was born. I was born in 1931, and they seem to have moved out in 32. And Dar remained very much in touch. But I think what made it possible for him to move out was that they must have decided they couldn't rear a family in there in the middle of the city and run the shop. He had a very successful business. He would drive down to Westmeath. He converted a car into a little pickup truck, and he would drive down and he would collect eggs from all the women around, and they'd have, you know, a dozen or 2 dozen eggs for him, and he would pay them and bring them up. And fresh eggs were apparently a rarity, and people came from Clontarf to buy eggs in Thomas Street because they were fresh. And so they made a success of the shop. But for whatever reason, and maybe stability, he then got a job in Gaeltacht as a warehouse man. So he now was, in effect, an employee of the government of the state, which he had been opposing so long. But he didn't have any problems. He wasn't dogmatic about things. He was more pragmatic, and in fact, having a very pragmatic wife and at that stage 4 children, he hadn't much choice but to be careful. He started out as a very lowly warehouse man, and I remember they were a very low grade in the civil service, a temporary, unestablished employee, and you could therefore be let go at a week's notice or something. And then there was great jubilation when in fact he was made permanent or something, or established or something like that. So he worked in a very Irish languagey environment there, and they dealt a lot with people from the Gaeltacht areas of Donegal, Mayo, not much Connemara, but certainly Kerry and West Cork and that. And girls from these areas who worked in the Gaeltacht factory in Crawley or in Ely Bay, out on the Erris Peninsula, they would sometimes come and work for maybe 6 months in the warehouse in Dublin and Feenan Street, the top of Westland Road there, Dunlop House, where John Boyd Dunlop started making tires first. And they would stay there to learn English, to learn proficiency in their English before going to work in England. And I met some of them in later years in my lighthouse travels in Castletown Bear and in Belmullet, the Gallagher's Trish and get his name now, John Gallagher. And they had great memories of my father and the times they had. I was a very lazy, easygoing place. And they brought back all this tweed, hand-woven tweed and toys and knitwear and embroidery and all. And in Dublin then it was distributed and sold out to shops and abroad, exported and all. So that was the sort of work he was doing, handling that sort of stuff. And he would tell us stories of American soldiers coming in after the war from Germany on their way back to America. And many of them, well, some of them would stop off in Ireland, and maybe having Irish connections, but also it was an English-speaking country. And they wanted to visit a bit more. And they would buy tweed and bring it home to Wives America because it was highly prized. So they could actually measure off lengths of tweed and buy it. And I have a receipt there somewhere where somebody bought stuff. And but they, in the money would all be pound shillings and pence and everything. But I remember my father coming home and telling that some of the Americans were saying, oh, we're making a mistake going home. We'll be sending our children back to fight the Russians. And indeed, they didn't. They went back themselves to fight the Russians. Like it wasn't that long, but they did think they were committing the next generation to battles. And sure, then the next generation were going to Vietnam and Korea and everywhere. But we were getting a little window into this world, which was so foreign to us and so amazing.
I think the whole idea of doing oral histories as part of this decade is, I think it's very important, because I think many of us of my age, I'm in my early 50s, you know, and so it's our grandparents who were part of the forming of our state. And they did so in all kinds of ways. Some did it in business, some did it in politics, some did it in the civil service. In my own family, you know, I grew up hearing stories of Westmeath and hearing some kind of tales of daring do, maybe of members of the family. And it wasn't until I was older and I read the record that my grandfather left with the Bureau of Military History, that I read his own account of it. And you know, and that was very, very interesting. I mean, as I read it, I realized I was getting a little kind of concerned. I hoped I wasn't going to read of acts of violence where lives were lost. I realized that as I felt it. But certainly, you know, to capture those stories and then through this exercise to hear my own father's memories of Westmeath, which was so important to the family. And then he's been having chats with his sister who's in the States, because most of that family emigrated. My dad was the one who stayed at home all the time, and one of his brothers, Uncle David, came back from Canada, but the rest were abroad. So I think capturing these tales, you know, is very important for all of us. We're all learning through this. And you know, my father was born in Thomas Street and grew up in Marino around the Malahide Road. But I think we always grew up feeling that he was from Westmeath. I certainly always had that sense. I mean, I would say, oh yeah, he was from Fairview, Marino, but I think I felt that he was more. I think he felt himself, you know, his memories of childhood were about getting on the bike or going around the fields and going down the lakes. And I mean, certainly that was his father's passion, you know. So, and the fact that my grandmother and grandfather were on adjoining farms in Glenidan. It was something. So, but there, you know, we would have gone down a bit, not a huge amount. I mean, I remember as a child hanging over a gate trying to get an echo out of a field in four, and I remember clambering over. I don't know, was it the monastery or the church down there? And I have memories of spectacular chips in Collinstown. But you know, they were just days out that we did. Our cousins would be second cousins, the Leonards there and you know, we had also there was another cousin of my father's in Anna, over the border. But they're you know, it's a curious thing. I would say, while I didn't spend, say, holidays down there, you know, in that sense, it was so close, it was a kind of a day trip thing. But I would have certainly always felt that it was a place of great happiness for my dad. And when the uncles would come home from Canada, or when the aunt would come home from America, there was always a day out to go around and not just visit the people, but visit the places. So I would say, you know, it's certainly very much, you know, part of his identity, and therefore part of, I suppose, our identity.